It's taken a while, but I have finally beaten Elden Ring. Clocking in at 120 hours, my level 170 character with a Bloodhound's Fang sank its last hit into the final boss, and it was all over. There was elation, there was a sigh of relief, as it was my longest single player campaign ever. But there was also this itch to play it all over again. A good sign if there ever was one, as I rarely repeat games. I'll probably hold off and move on to something else, but I could easily play another 300 hours of this if I was on summer holidays. In that lengthy playtime, Elden Ring was never dull, and there was always this need, perhaps addiction, to progress to one more side of grace, or level up one more time so a new weapon or piece of equipment could be tinkered around with. While Elden Ring is a brand new IP from developer From Software, the game has been built on a foundation of Souls game design. Which leads to, I think, the most pertinent question of this review: who is this game for? Is this game for newcomers looking to break into Souls games, or Souls veterans looking for a harder challenge? And if you played the previous games and couldn't get into them, would you be able to get into this? I hope to answer these questions and more in this review. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out my channel page for more Elden Ring content. There's a Let's Play series on Elden Ring, along with farming guides for leveling up and other fun content. From Software has created a new world for Elden Ring, the Lands Between. G.R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, is credited with writing a short story outlining the world setting, while Hidetaka Miyazaki, creator and director of the Dark Souls series, is also the creator, writer and director for Elden Ring. When the game opens in Limgrave, the Lands Between has a very Dark Souls, traditional, medieval-like feel, filled with sinister, deadly and at times horror-like undertones. Everything is out to destroy you. And from minute one, Elden Ring's intentions are clear. The first encounter is a mandatory boss battle, the Grafted Scion, that will surely defeat 99% of players still struggling to work out what L1 and R1 buttons do. Not long after, as you walk out into the open world, the Tree Sentinel is a reminder that every moment is precarious. Again, it's not a battle that new players are expected to win, but it's yet another unsubtle cue to the player to find alternatives. From here, the Lands Between is divided into a number of areas, 25 or so areas according to the Fextra Game Progress Guide, making for a very long game with tons of content. Limgrave, as has been said, is a take on dark medieval fantasy, with rundown castles and ancient stone ruins making much of the scenery. Lernia of the Lakes takes place around a very large, shallow lake, home to the Academy of Raya Lucaria, a place for dark magicians to gather and learn. Lernia is perhaps the biggest, most fleshed out area of the game, with access points to underground areas like Ansel River. To the east of Limgrave is Caelid, which literally means inflamed field in Old Welsh. If you're after a challenge, come straight here after Limgrave. The enemies hit hard, and you'll have to deal with Scarlet Rot, a poison-like effect that will deplete your hit points very quickly. It might seem like an eternity, but Atlas Plateau and Mount Gelmir represents the mid-game, and when you think you've seen it all in Elden Ring, it just keeps on getting better. To the east of Atlas Plateau is Leyndell, the royal capital built right at the heart of the Erd Tree, a massive, gigantic tree rising kilometers into the sky that's worshipped by the inhabitants of the land. Leyndell itself as an area is as spectacular as any city that's ever graced a fantasy role-playing game. You start from the top overlooking the city, but the exploration through the town is rewarding, unsettling, and epic. Leyndell is large. Enemies lurk around every corner out to stop you from reaching the sites of grace, which act as checkpoints to save progress. Exploring thoroughly means working from the higher class, grander buildings to the less impressive ones down the hill, and all the way down into sewage and drainage systems before finally making your way back up to the royal palaces and the Elden Throne location. But of course, it doesn't end there. There's also a huge journey to get to the next legacy dungeon, Miquella's Haligtree, through the mountaintops of the Giants and the consecrated snowfield. Each area filled with catacombs, tunnels, and ruins of their own, with loot and runes as major reasons to keep exploring. And just when you think the Halley Tree couldn't be topped as a Souls dungeon, From Software comes up with Crumbling Farum Azula, an area ripped apart by tornadoes, creating ruins and platforms in every possible direction. If you've ever been confused about directions in a Souls dungeon, Crumbling Farum Azula will really have you try to figure out how to get to where you want to go. And while I barely scratched the surface in discussing them, I hope just giving a glimpse of these locations at least gives you an idea of the scope of the game. It's clear that From Software wanted to blow away people's expectations on perception of scale and scope of what an open world is. It's accentuated by the heights of objects in the game, the mountains, towers and bridges being oversized in every way. It certainly makes things look way more epic. And the variety here goes deeper than just your medieval fantasy artistic design seen in Limgrave. As you take the elevator down into Siofra River, you see the limitless star-filled sky and realize this is no ordinary underground level. We'll travel deep into Noxtella Eternal City and explore a silvery, glittery ancient city that is a little alien and gothic. And somehow the art style stays consistent from beginning to end as you travel from Limgrave to Lernia of the Lakes, Landell and beyond. All in all, I think the world and the setting are Elden Ring's most impressive aspect. The combat could have been less interesting, and yet this game would still have enthralled due to the world building. Speaking of combat, let's dive into one of the main reasons why From Software games are so beloved. Part of the appeal is that the player isn't locked to a specific class like a warrior or sorcerer, but rather molded into the type of character the player wants to be depending on the weapons and equipment they find. It's an interesting system that has its advantages and disadvantages. This is great for players who want to try weapons as they find them and find one they enjoy using. Another aspect is that players by mid-game will have the ability to respec their characters and adjust their attribute points to use different weapons if they wish. In this way, they can go from a warrior to a sorcerer fairly easily. The flip side to this is that the game has been designed with weapons in fixed locations, and players will pick up the same equipment on repeat playthroughs. And if you explore maps entirely, as many players will, you'll end up picking up almost every weapon the game has to offer on the first playthrough. Weapons and armor can also be used from the early game all the way to the end of the game by upgrading them to their maximum level. For example, the Bloodhound's Fang, a great curved sword, was dropped by a boss very early on in Limgrave, which I used all the way to the end of the game because it was such a great weapon. I eventually had it maxed out about 80% of the way through, and although I wanted to try other weapons, I hadn't collected enough smithing stones to upgrade the other weapons, so I ended up using the one weapon throughout the whole game. That was a little disappointing, especially as the Bloodhound's Fang wasn't able to use Ashes of War, skills that you can add on to weapons, and it would have been fun to try out the range of Ashes of War skills I had collected. While there's a great range of weapons from swords to axes to poleaxes to clubs, and you could even main a bow and arrow if you wanted to, the range of armor seems a little disappointing and more cosmetic than I had expected. The majority of the time I chose the armor with the highest physical defense, and when it came to areas of Scarlet Rot, I used armor that increased my immunity. I ended up with around 40 pieces of body armor that were all very similar to each other, and most of it was just not used. Perhaps Elden Ring weapons and armor is a little too basic, and it could have done with more stat improvements. Games like Diablo or even Neo have a range of stat improvements which give players opportunity to think and experiment with weapons and equipment. When I played Demon's Souls back when it first came out on the PS3, I said at the time this had the best combat in any video game that I had ever played. And here we are 13 years later, and the Souls combat still stands the test of time as one of the best in the business. Aside from Neo, what other real-time combat game demands the test of skill and focus while being so simple to understand? Games like Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter definitely have brilliant and beautiful gameplay, but I don't think either capture a 1 versus 1 contest as purely as a Souls game does with its carefully timed attacks and limited stamina. Using a different weapon can vastly change the experience of the game too. A great curved sword will have different animations to a regular longsword, and if you've been using a particular weapon for a while and switch, it can immediately feel awkward due to the animation length of the new weapon. On my playthrough, I think I ended up using Bloodhound's Fang a little too much, if only because I wanted to use my strongest weapon all the time. But I'd recommend mixing it up when you can, and even using some of the weaker weapons on regular enemies just for the fun of it. Let's talk about enemy encounters, and while I always had fun killing whatever enemy was in front of me, many of the regular enemies were not a challenge at all. Now, I'm assuming if they made every enemy more difficult, the game would be a slog to get through as a result of more drawn out encounters, but on average, about 40% of every level had very weak enemies, about 40% had tougher enemies that would test you in a group situation, but were fairly easy 1v1, and about 20% of the level had enemies where you had to bring your A game, otherwise you were mincemeat. The developers also make things tougher by putting enemies in odd places, like dropping down on you from above or behind corners, but you end up learning to look in those places. When you consider the easiest and most optimal strategy is to kite every enemy from a group into a 1v1 situation, then you're largely looking at about 80% of the level as being fairly easy if you become clinical and methodical. That said, the feeling of not making it to the next side of grace is always there, which makes the game really tense. I was generally impressed by the enemy designs artistically and mechanically. The regular grunt soldiers are fairly boring to look at and fight, but the knights are tall and intimidating and tough to beat even in the late game. The knights in the ruins outside Stormgate gave me a good fight for an hour or so. The decision to place the giant trolls at Stormgate is ingenious, as it felt like a boss fight even though the game classed it as a regular enemy. And it's at this point, if a giant troll is a regular enemy, then you're wondering just how difficult the game is going to get. As you make your way throughout the game, there's a good variety of enemies, though it's clear by about the halfway point the game has to reuse many of its enemy designs. I do think part of the reason why is so they can save up its creative designs for future games, and it's not just a case of the developers reducing costs or work. I also expected a little bit more variety between the regular enemies and their movesets. Over the course of 100 hours, my general playstyle of using a sword and shield, rolling through attacks didn't change very much. The game also puts the player on defense to start a lot of the time. It just makes so much more sense to wait and bait an attack first, before attacking. After beating Elden Ring, I immediately went to play Neo to remind myself what that game was like, and it definitely feels like the players have the choice of attacking or defending any given situation. Like I said earlier, there are positives and negatives to most aspects of game design, and with the boss battles, given the size and scope of the game, there are a huge number of boss battles in this game. I can't tell you if this is the most ever in a From Software game, but I wouldn't bet against it. There are at least 120 bosses with health bars in this game, and some of them come back for more whooping later on. Given its open world, most aren't mandatory, and many are at the end of optional caves and tunnels. Technically speaking, there are actually very few mandatory bosses, and if you dared, you would only have to do the very few absolutely mandatory ones to finish the game, but doing only those parts would leave you severely underleveled. Because there are so many bosses, it seems like many bosses share concepts and movesets. One large subset of this are the beasts, like dragons, large lizards, deers, and other animals. These enemies charge and stomp at you most of the time. Dragons also like to do tail swipes, which take off a significant chunk of health, and they also like to fly around, which means they take a little bit more effort to follow them around the arena. The other group are humanoid enemies that carry a weapon. These tend to be more interesting in how they fight, and the player has to watch for different moves and when to dodge attacks. They also range in size from regular sized Crucible Knights all the way to Valiant Gargoyles. I enjoyed all the boss battles in the game, mostly because I didn't take the content too seriously, but I can see how some fans were disappointed with the boss designs in general, and because From Software decided to add more bosses, we ended up with many that are very similar. Fans looking for boss battles to be challenges might be disappointed too, but I think this is ultimately a decision by From Software to make the game more accessible and sell more copies of the game. There are very obvious design decisions why the boss battles in this game are more accessible. The game offers so many ways to make the game less difficult for newcomers who are willing to explore and find ways to improve their character. The quickest and best way is to farm enemies and level up quickly. In Limgrave, there are a number of simple giant troll enemies, particularly the two tied to the caravan, that can be farmed over and over for some quick levels to boost stats. Another way to improve your character is to farm upgradable smithing stones to upgrade your weapons and boost damage output. A huge and almost game-changing design is the use of Ash's summons, which essentially gives you an AI character for co-op. This affects boss battles greatly, as the boss has to divide his attention between the summon and you, meaning there are opportunities to get some free, quick hits, greatly lowering the difficulty of the game. Wearing specific armor and items can also help in times of need. For example, when you need more Scarlet Rot protection, you can wear armor and talismans to help. Crafting items also rewards users who like to pick up every item on offer, meaning you don't have to pay runes and can save them for leveling up. Sites of Grace are very close to each other and usually right before a boss fight, and there are many more ways the game has made it more accessible for newcomers. If you're wondering if this game is too hard, if you're willing to explore and grind a little bit for levels, this is perhaps the most accessible Souls game to date. And that goes for newcomers who've never played a Souls game, as well as people who found past games too tough. If you use every available tool given to you, this game isn't difficult at all. But back to the boss battles. Having a summon hugely lowers the difficulty of the fight, to the point that if you're also overleveled as well, the boss battle can be over in less than a minute. For some people, that's got to feel a little anticlimactic, especially if you toiled your way through the dungeon for over an hour to get to the boss fight. You could say the summons are overpowered, but if it were, they would have fixed it in an update, so it seems that's the way it was intended. At first, using Ashes of Wolves in the early levels, the summon didn't last very long, and would help to get a couple of extra hits into the boss. But by the time you've gained the maximum leveled Mimic tier, it can pretty much destroy a main boss all by itself. Having a summon do the work also means players can beat the boss without actually having played well. I barely touched Godfrey, first Elden Lord in Leyndell, and my Mimic tier did 75% of the work. While I know some people don't particularly like this concept, there's nothing really stopping the player from playing it the way they want to play it. I think we've all played games where we've been stuck on bosses and abandoned the game, so I think it's very difficult to design so many bosses with a perfect difficulty level on each, and also make sure that everyone can beat it. And I think that's why ultimately that the summons are designed to be overpowered to make sure players can get past bosses. For Souls veterans a little unhappy with how easy the game is, I think playing through without summons and decreasing the amount of help from weapons and armor is a great way to make this game harder. From Software are still the absolute kings of the fantasy role-playing genre, and from an artistic point of view, Elden Ring is just incredible to look at. Nobody does medieval castles quite like them, and it seems every time they make a game, they make it a point to have the grandest castles in gaming. But it goes beyond castles. Academy of Raya Lucaria is a level design of beauty, a huge building complex at one of the highest points in the area that can be seen from miles around. It has twisting corridors inside while also being completely playable on the rooftops outside. The rooftops isn't this free roaming area, it's actually quite linear. It leads you up and down around corners, requiring jumps to get around, all the while having no idea where you're actually heading toward. And that's the beauty of From Software's level design. Most of the time the player is lost, and yet from afar the external architecture makes the building seem inherently normal. Like I said, Elden Ring artistically is beautiful. I went back to Dark Souls on the Nintendo Switch afterwards, and it really showed its age. When Dark Souls came out, it was one of the best looking games for me because it really nailed its art style. In Elden Ring, it's the same, but there's so much more detail in everything. Not just on the motifs, on the structures and buildings, because I think Souls games have always been good on that front. But Elden Ring just has tons of objects and details everywhere. This is really noticeable in the legacy dungeons, particularly in Leyndell, where it really helps sell the environment and makes it interesting to explore. Technically though, it looks a little dated, though it has to be said From Software has been working on this for a long time, before Sekiro started, and let's not forget it's a cross-platform game between last gen and this gen. There are some areas with very poor quality shadows that seem like it's a mistake. The characters and enemies seem like they have a PS4 level of polygon count to them, and it's clear that From Software didn't mind all that much about animating the cutscenes because the characters' lips barely move.
Into fear, doubt, and loneliness.
Together we will devour the very god.
On the PC side of things, I'm on an i9-10900K with an RTX 3070 playing at 1440p resolution. The game has, since launch, had some very random stuttering all the way through the game. I've heard that it might be due to the anti-cheat software in the background. If so, I don't completely blame the game design itself, but it is worth mentioning for people who want perfectly smooth performance. It's possible some people won't even experience it, because I did get play sessions that were stutter free. Overall, Elden Ring from a graphical standpoint is a reasonably good looking game, though not the best looking game, but it makes up for its technical graphical shortcomings by having an incredible art style. Sound design though is absolutely superb. The music in every area sets the mood beautifully, ramping up to thunderous but emotional boss themes. There are constantly alienating and concerning sound effects in empty tunnels, and the enemies howl like they do in horror movies. I've done a lot of videos on Elden Ring, but I feel like there's still a lot more to say. There's a ton of stuff I didn't do in the game through my first playthrough. I didn't collect all the cookbooks for crafting. I didn't really try out many of the magic spells, of which there is a huge amount of gameplay to explore. Despite the amount of knowledge accrued, knowing enemy placements, enemy movesets, and what quests to do, and where to explore, I'm still eager to play Elden Ring again. Because I put so many hours in, it now feels like a comfort game as I have full muscle memory of the controls, and I can have a good time immediately. Elden Ring though is a huge triumph, a game everybody should play and can play. Veterans can tweak this to make it easy or as hard as they like, whether it be through speedrunning the game with no hits or doing a naked level 1 run, while newcomers get a wealth of aid including summons, easily farmed enemies, vastly more sights of grace than before, and much more. Meanwhile, anyone that's had trouble in the past might just find this to be the easiest and most fun game From Software have made. Don't miss what could possibly be the game of the year and one of the greatest games of all time.